The Olympics, the pinnacle of human achievement. When we think of marathon, we think of elite athletes, hydration gels, and people who have 0% body fat running 26 miles faster than I can drive my car to McDonald's. But it wasn't always like this. Let's go back to 1904, St. Louis, Missouri. This wasn't just an Olympics, it was a crime scene. The 1904 marathon is widely considered the single stupidest sporting event in human history. We had athletes drinking rat poison for energy. We had a guy who stopped to take a nap in the middle of the race. We had the winner disqualify himself because he took an Uber to the finish line. And the organizer, he intentionally refused to give them water because he wanted to see what would happen. It was basically Squid Game, but with more dust. So today, let's break down the race that nearly killed everyone involved, the 1904 Olympic Marathon. To understand why this race was such a disaster, you have to meet the man in charge, James Sullivan. James was the chief organizer of the games, and he had a very interesting theory about sports science. He believed that drinking water while exercising was a sign of weakness. So, he decided to use the marathon as a science experiment to test purposeful dehydration. So, for a 26-mile race and 90-degree heat, or 32 degrees Celsius, he provided exactly one water station. And where was it? Mile 11. If you were thirsty before mile 11, die. If you were thirsty after mile 11, also die. The course itself was a nightmare. It wasn't a paved track, it was a dirt road full of loose dust. And because this was 1904, the officials were driving alongside the runners in cars. Cars back then didn't have emission standards. They just spewed black smoke and kicked up massive clouds of dust directly into the runner's face. One runner, William Garcia from California, actually collapsed on the side of the road with a torn esophagus. The dust had coated his throats and lungs so badly, he started hemorrhaging. He was found unconscious and nearly died. So, to recap, no water, extreme heat, and the air is made of poison. Let's meet the athletes. But before we look at the runners, you have to understand the vibe of these Olympics. The 1904 games were technically just a sideshow for the St. Louis World's Fair, and James Sullivan decided to use this opportunity to host something called the Anthropology Days. Basically, he gathered all the indigenous people who were being displayed in the World's Fair, human zoos, people from the Philippines, Patagonia, and Central Africa, and forced them to compete in Olympic events they had literally never seen before. His goal? To scientifically prove that white American athletes were genetically superior. He made tribesmen throw shot puts and run sprints in boots. When they performed poorly, because they had never held a shot put in their lives, Sullivan wrote a paper claiming this proved the civilized man was a peak of evolution. It was racist science at its finest. The best part, the only event the indigenous people did like were things like greased pole climbing and mud throwing, which Sullivan hated because they weren't dignified. So keep in mind, the guy organizing the marathon didn't view the runners as athletes. To him, everyone was just a lab rat in a weird Victorian experiment. With that level of respect for human life established, let's see who actually signed up for the marathons. The roster for this race sounds like a setup for a bad joke. First, we have the Americans, specifically Sam Miller, the favorite, and Thomas Hicks. Hicks is important. Remember him. He looks like he's already dead in every photo. Then we have Andren Carvajal. He was a Cuban postman. He didn't have a sponsor. He literally raised the money to get to St. Louis by running around Cuba, begging for cash. When he arrived in New Orleans, he lost all his money gambling on dice. So, he had to hitchhike and walk the rest of the way to St. Louis. He showed up to the starting line wearing his work clothes, heavy boots, long trousers, and a long sleeve shirt. Another runner felt bad for him and used a pair of scissors to cut his pants into shorts right before the gun went off. He is my hero. Then we have Len Tao and Jan Mashani. They were Tswana tribesmen from South Africa who were actually in St. Louis for the World's Fair Boer War exhibit. They weren't technically there to race, but they saw the starting line and said, "Sure, why not?" They ran barefoot. They were the first black Africans to ever compete in the Olympics. And finally, Fred Lors. Fred was a bricklayer by day, runner by night. He is the chaotic evil of the story. Okay, the gun goes off, 32 runners start, and only 14 will finish. The race starts, and immediately, things go wrong. The heat is brutal, the dust is choking everyone. Fred Lors, the bricklayer, gets cramps at mile 9. He decided, screw this, and drops out. He waves down one of the support cars and hitches a ride. He spent the next 11 miles sitting in the passenger seat, waving at the spectators and runners he's passing. Keep this in mind for later. Meanwhile, our Cuban postman, Carvajal, is hungry. He hasn't eaten in 40 hours. He stops in the orchard to eat some apples, and bad news, the apples are rotten. He immediately gets catastrophic stomach cramps. Does he quit? No. He lies down on the side of the road and takes a nap. He sleeps for a while, wakes up, feels better, and starts running again. And spoiler alert, he still finished 4th. If he hadn't eaten the poison apple, he probably would have won gold. Over on the other side of the course, the South African runner, Len Tao, is doing great. Until he gets chased by wild dogs. Actual feral dogs chase him a mile off course. He managed to escape, but running an extra mile in a marathon usually hurts your time. He still finished 9th. But the real horror story is Thomas Hicks, the American. By mile 10, Hicks is hallucinating. He's begging for water. His trainers, who were clearly trying to kill him, refused. Instead, they decided to give him a performance enhancer. They fed him a mixture of strychnine and brandy. For those of you who aren't chemists, strychnine is rat poison. In small doses, it acts as a stimulant. In large doses, it stops your heart. They basically gave him a heart attack in a cup. He takes the poison. He keeps running. A few miles later, he collapses again. They give him more poison and more brandy. By the last mile, Hicks isn't running. He is shuffling. He thinks the finish line is 20 miles away. He is hallucinating. His trainers are practically carrying him, holding him up by his arms while his feet are dragging in the dirt. Suddenly, who bursts across the finish line? It's Fred Lors, the guy who got in the car. The car had broken down at mile 19, so Fred decided to jog the rest of the way. He breaks the tape, the crowd goes wild. Alice Roosevelt, the president's daughter, is about to put the gold medal around his neck. Just before he gets the medal, someone yells, "Hey, that guy was in the Buick." Fred laughs and says, "Just a joke, guys. I was just kidding." And they banned him for life, which lasted a year. Finally, Thomas Hicks, the rat poison man, shuffles across the line. He is technically the winner. He collapses immediately. Doctors had to treat him on the spot because he was arguably dying of poisoning. He lost 8 pounds during the race and said, "Never again." So, that was the 1904 marathon. A race won by a man on rat poison, and won by a man in a car, and starring a napping postman, and a guy running from dogs. It was such a disaster that the Olympic Committee briefly considered banning the marathon from the Olympics forever. Thankfully, we learned our lesson. Now we give runners water. But honestly, I kinda miss the chaos. Bring back the brandy and the wild dogs. It makes for better TV. Thanks for watching. Don't drink rat poison. Bye.